When the United States deployed tanks to Vietnam, they were fighting in an environment completely opposite from what they were built for. The enemy didn't have almost any armor. There were no open fields and no tank battles like in World War II Europe. But near the very end of the war, everything would change, when out of nowhere, a full-on tank charge happened that no one saw coming. American tanks were there to meet it, but not with American crews. We will get to that in a moment, but first we need to set the stage. By 1965, American leadership believed that the only way to stop the spread of communism in Vietnam was to commit ground forces. So they did just that. The first boots hit the ground when 3,500 Marines landed at Da Nang, bringing with them 2 full platoons of tanks. But the war they were preparing for was not the war they got. The entire US military was still thinking in Cold War terms. For decades, they had trained to stop Soviet tank divisions on the wide open plains of Europe. Soviet T-54s charging across fields, meeting US armor head-on. Everything from weapons to tactics was built for that kind of war. Vietnam was not that war. Instead of open terrain, they found themselves in dense jungle, swamps, rice paddies and narrow roads. Instead of massive tank clashes, they were hunting an enemy that didn't want to be found, much less fight conventionally. But commanders still believed that overwhelming firepower could force the enemy into a decisive engagement, so they sent in tanks. The main vehicle was the M48A3 Patton, the most modern American tank at the time. It had a 90mm gun, more than 100mm of frontal armor, and was excellent for traditional tank-on-tank engagements. The problem was, there weren't any. Alongside the Pattons came a variety of other armoured vehicles. The M113 armoured personnel carriers were used to move troops and support them with light fire. Some Pattons were modified into so-called Zippos, replacing the main gun with a flamethrower. Then there was the M48, a small, strange-looking vehicle fitted with 6 recoilless rifles. And finally the M551 Sheridan, a light tank that could be airdropped and carried a massive 152mm gun. The North Vietnamese had some armor of their own, but early in the war, it was rarely seen. Older Soviet T-34s and Chinese Type 59s would appear later. We will come to that. Interestingly, the Australians deployed their own British-made Centurion tanks to Vietnam. They used far fewer of them, but they were more cautious, more selective in how they used them, and in many battles, their tank crews would be far more effective than anyone expected. At first, American tanks were mostly used to guard bases and hold supply routes, but that would change with Operation Starlight. Intelligence reports suggested a major Viet Cong attack was coming, so the plan was to hit them first and break their positions before they could strike. Tanks were brought in to secure convoys, delivering urgently needed supplies. But there was one critical mistake. The armoured column advanced without infantry support, moving through narrow jungle roads with no eyes in the trees and no protection on the flanks. They were walking straight into a trap. That trap was sprung when the lead tank on a narrow road took a direct hit from an RPG, just short of open ground where they could have mounted a proper defence. The knocked-out tank blocked the road and trapped the rest of the convoy inside the jungle. Then the real ambush began. The Viet Cong swarmed the column and brutal, close-range fighting broke out. Communication failed and the convoy began to fall apart. The last tank in the line managed to reverse out and go for help, while the only remaining operational tank kept firing, preventing the entire convoy from being wiped out. Eventually, the enemy pulled back, expecting American reinforcements to arrive, and the survivors were rescued the following day. Operation Starlight was a success on paper, but in that first real tank engagement, nearly a quarter of the crews were killed or wounded. And this was just the beginning. Over the next few years, American troop numbers surged, and hundreds of tanks were sent in, but it was already clear they were being used in the wrong kind of war. American commanders still believed the enemy would eventually stand and fight in a conventional battle, and when that happened, American tanks and firepower would win. Although something like that would eventually happen, but not in a way anyone could imagine, for now the jungle had other plans. The terrain neutralized every advantage armor was supposed to have. Tanks could only move on known roads and trails, which made them predictable and easy targets for mines, ambushes and RPGs. Viet Cong fighters would get so close to American units that tanks couldn't use their long-range firepower, a tactic known as hugging the belt. The M48's big gun wasn't much help at such close range, where it couldn't even depress far enough to fire at enemies up close. So tank crews were forced to get creative. Gunners would ride exposed on top of the turret with a shotgun or grenade launcher, while the tank commander could also fire the main gun from his position. Beehive shells, firing thousands of steel darts, were ideal for close-range engagements. Crews joked they were scratching each other's backs, firing beehives into swarmed tanks to clear them off, which did actually happen in multiple engagements. But fighting wasn't just in the jungle. When the Tet Offensive erupted in 1968, tank crews found themselves in brutal urban combat. Cities like Hue turned into death traps for tanks, with RPGs launched from windows, alleys, and rooftops, exploiting every blind spot. Crews had barely any visibility, and to make everything even worse, commanders restricted their fire to avoid damaging historic buildings, worried about how it would look to the public back home. Tankers had to request permission to shoot each time, even if someone was pointing an RPG right at them. Frustrating is probably an understatement to describe their position. However, soon, American tanks would finally get the kind of battle they were designed for, but it would be nothing like anyone expected. Although the North Vietnamese army had some tanks since the late 1950s, they didn't actually use them in combat until 1968, especially more modern ones like the Soviet-supplied T-54. In March 1969, the first actual tank-on-tank battle of the Vietnam War broke out at the remote base Ben Het, where 3 American M48s had been dug in on high ground. Using infrared night vision, they spotted the silhouettes of incoming PT-76 light amphibious tanks and prepared to fire. For once, the conditions finally favored American armor. 2 enemy tanks were destroyed in quick succession. A third got off a lucky shot, hitting an open hatch and killing 2 American crewmen. But the North Vietnamese tanks soon withdrew. It was one of the very few engagements in Vietnam where tanks were used exactly as they were designed. But that wasn't the end of their story, it was only the beginning. As American forces began pulling out in the early 1970s, the North Vietnamese, with support from the Soviet Union and China, were preparing something massive. The Easter Offensive of 1972 saw over 150 tanks charging alongside 30,000 troops. The war that once seemed like the worst possible place for tanks had suddenly become a full-scale conventional assault like in World War II. American leftover M48s, now in the hands of South Vietnamese crews, took position on high ground to stop the enemy tank spearhead. In one engagement, they destroyed 11 T-54s in quick succession, but the attack was heavy and well prepared and lasted for 7 months. The final blow came in 1975, when North Vietnamese armor rolled into Saigon. So, American tanks were sent into a war that never matched the fight they were built for, and then removed just before it finally did. If you like what we're doing and want to see more, consider subscribing to support the channel.